It's time to find perfect squares. So notice here we have a perfect square. And what do we know about a square? Well, a square has the exact same length of each side. So think about finding the area of a square, right? A square is simply a rectangle. So the area is length times width. Sometimes people talk about side times side, but basically we take 3 times 3 and we get 9. Now, since 9 is the product of multiplying two identical numbers, 9 is what we call a perfect square. So how do we find perfect squares? Well, think about the squaring of any number. So 2 squared is 4. The numbers I'm putting in this green big rectangle are perfect squares. So 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is 9. 4 times 4, which is 16. So to find a perfect square, we simply multiply a number by itself. Now, I am highly recommending that you memorize. And this isn't difficult if you know your multiplication facts. Memorizing perfect squares is not hard, because when you're thinking about factoring difference of squares or other mathematical concepts, it's important for you to say, hey, I recognize that 81 is a perfect square because it's 9 times 9. So when you go through and you're looking at what are all of the perfect squares, we could continue this, right? We could say 13 squared and get 169, and 14 squared, which I believe is 256. No, it's not. That's too high. 256 is 16 squared. This is 196. And having the idea that when you see these numbers, you're like, that looks familiar. And I think it's pretty good. 10 and under are pretty easy because we know our multiplication facts. And if we don't, we should. But when you get higher than 10, maybe you don't have them memorized, but you've seen them enough and you've practiced them enough that you recognize them. And you're like, hey, 121, that says something important in my head. So when you're finding perfect squares, just remember, it's a number multiplied by itself. So anytime we have, let's just say I give you 64 and you see that, we can obviously multiply a lot of numbers together to get 64. But this is a perfect square because 8 times 8 gives us 64. And that's what you want to be able to come up with in your head when you see a number that you can say, hey, that is a perfect square.